So just to sum up that argument of Sri Aurobindo and of Newman regarding our ability or inability to know spiritual reality, in the beginning of this chapter, Brahman, Purusha, Ishvara, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti, Sri Aurobindo says, in the ordinary tongue of metaphysical thought, we have to be content with a distant indication and approximation by abstractions, which may still be of some service to our intellect, for it is this kind of speech which suits our method of logical and rational understanding. But if it is to be of real service, the intellect must consent to pass out of the bounds of a finite logic and accustom itself to the logic of the infinite. On this condition alone, by this way of seeing and thinking, it ceases to be paradoxical or futile to speak of the ineffable. But if we insist on applying a finite logic to the infinite, the omnipresent reality will escape us, and we shall grasp instead an abstract shadow, a dead form petrified into speech, or a hard, incisive graph which speaks of the reality but does not express it. Our way of knowing must be appropriate to that which is to be known. Otherwise, we achieve only a distant speculation, a figure of knowledge, and not veritable knowledge. He says, in order to express this experience of the omnipresent reality, or this idea with any nearness, a language has to be created, which is at once intuitively metaphysical and revealingly poetic, admitting significant and living images as the vehicle of a close, suggestive, and vivid indication, a language such as we find hammered out into a subtle and pregnant massiveness in the Veda and the Upanishads. So it has been my contention for a few years now that this was Sri Aurobindo's primary mission, to create a language through which these spiritual truths can be effectively conveyed. Because Sanskrit is no longer available to us. And similarly with other inspired languages of the past. And so it requires two things: the vision itself, the consciousness of that reality, and an extraordinary creative genius. And when those two things come together throughout history, there are inspiring, powerful teachings that do have a significant impact for ages and ages. So I think that this was Sri Aurobindo's primary objective. I'm going to read a passage regarding the Brahman and Purusha, and then I'm from this book, The Life Divine, and then I'm going to read a passage from Savitri, which is expressing the same ideas. And we can see that this is far superior to what we've heard so far today, and that Savitri will be a quantum leap beyond this. Brahman, the reality, is the self-existent absolute, and Maya is the consciousness and force of this self-existence. But with regard to the universe, Brahman appears as the self of all existence, Atman, the cosmic self, but also as the supreme self, transcendent of its own cosmicity and at the same time individual, universal in each being. Maya can then be seen as the self-power, Atma Shakti of the Atman. It is true that when we first become aware of this aspect, it is usually in a silence of the whole being, or at the least in a silence within, which draws back or stands away from the surface action. This self is then felt as a status in silence, an immobile, immutable being, self-existent, pervading the whole universe, omnipresent in all, but not dynamic or active, aloof from the ever-mobile energy of Maya. In the same way, we can become aware of it as the Purusha, separate from Prakriti, the conscious being standing back from the activities of nature. But this is an exclusive concentration which limits itself to a spiritual status and puts away from it all activity in order to realize the freedom of Brahman, the self-existent reality from all limitations by its own action and manifestation. It is an essential realization, but not the total realization. For we can see that the conscious power, the Shakti that acts and creates, is not other than the Maya or all knowledge of Brahman. It is the power of the self. Prakriti is the working of the Purusha, conscious being active by its own nature. The duality then of soul and world energy, silent self and the creative power of the spirit is not really something dual and separate. It is biune. As we cannot separate fire and the power of fire, it has been said, so we cannot separate the divine reality and its consciousness force, Chit Shakti. This first realization of self as something intensely silent and purely static is not the whole truth of it. There can also be a realization of self in its power, self as the condition of world activity and world existence. However, the self is a fundamental aspect of Brahman, but with a certain stress on its impersonality. Therefore, the power of the self has the appearance of a force that acts automatically with the self sustaining it, witness and support and originator and enjoyer of its activities, but not involved in them for a moment. As soon as we become aware of the self, we are conscious of it as eternal, unborn, unembodied, uninvolved in its workings. It can be felt within the form of being, but also as enveloping it, as above it, surveying its embodiment from above. It is omnipresent, the same in everything, infinite and pure and intangible forever. This self can be experienced as the self of the individual, the self of the thinker, doer, enjoyer. But even so, it always has this greater character. Its individuality is at the same time a vast universality, or very readily passes into that. And the next step to that is a sheer transcendence or a complete and ineffable passing into the absolute. The self is that aspect of the Brahman in which it is intimately felt as at once individual, cosmic, transcendent of the universe. The realization of the self is the straight and swift way towards individual liberation, a static universality, a nature transcendence. At the same time, there is a realization of self in which it is felt not only sustaining and pervading and enveloping all things, but constituting everything, and identified in a free identity with all its becomings in nature. Even so, freedom and impersonality are always the character of the self. There is no appearance of subjection to the workings of its own power in the universe, such as the apparent subjection of the Purusha to Prakriti. To realize the self is to realize the eternal freedom of the spirit. The conscious being, Purusha, is the self as originator, witness, support, and lord and enjoyer of the forms and works of nature. As the aspect of self is in its essential character transcendental even when involved and identified with its universal and individual becomings, so the Purusha aspect is characteristically universal, individual, and intimately connected with nature even when separated from her. For this conscious spirit, while retaining its impersonality and eternity, its universality puts on, at the same time, a more personal aspect. It is the impersonal, personal being in nature, from whom it is not altogether detached, for it is always coupled with her. Nature acts for the Purusha and by its sanction, for its will and pleasure. The conscious being imparts its consciousness to the energy we call nature, receives in that consciousness her workings as in a mirror, accepts the forms which she, the executive cosmic force, creates and imposes on it, gives or withdraws its sanction from her movements. The experience of Purusha Prakriti, the spirit or conscious being in its relations to nature, is of immense pragmatic importance, for on these relations the whole play of the consciousness depends in the embodied being. If the Purusha in us is passive and allows nature to act, accepting all she imposes on him, giving a constant automatic sanction, then the soul in mind, life, body, the mental, vital, physical being in us becomes subject to our nature, ruled by its formation, driven by its activities. That is the normal state of our ignorance. If the Purusha in us becomes aware of itself as the witness and stands back from nature, that is the first step to the soul's freedom, for it becomes detached, and it is possible then to know nature and her processes and in all independence, since we are no longer involved in her works to accept or not to accept, to make the sanction no longer automatic, but free and effective. We can choose what she shall do or not do in us, or we can stand back altogether from her works and withdraw easily into the self's spiritual silence. Or we can reject her present formations and rise to a spiritual level of existence, and from there recreate our existence. The Purusha can cease to be subject and become lord of its nature.